Close your eyes and imagine the dusty streets of first-century Jerusalem. The temple stands in golden splendor on the mount. Pilgrims move through its courts, and Roman soldiers watch from stone towers. In the marketplaces and synagogues, voices rise in debate. Learned men quoting scripture, arguing about purity, law, and truth. These are the Pharisees and Sadducees, two groups that shaped the religious and political life of the Jewish people during the time of Jesus. Their names appear often in the New Testament, yet their true identity is often misunderstood. Were they enemies? Were they scholars? Were they holy men? Or hypocrites, as Jesus called some of them? To understand their world is to understand the faith, politics, and tensions that defined the final days of the Second Temple. The first century was an age of faith and turmoil. Judea was under Roman occupation, and the people longed for freedom. Some dreamed of rebellion, others waited for divine intervention. Religion was not separate from politics. It was the lifeblood of national identity. The temple in Jerusalem was the beating heart, but synagogues had spread throughout the towns and villages, becoming places of learning and prayer. In this world, different Jewish groups, or sects, emerged. They all worshipped the same God, read the same scriptures, and honored the same law of Moses. But they differed deeply in how they understood that law, how they interpreted purity, and how they thought God's kingdom would come. Among these groups, two names stood above the rest: the Pharisees and the Sadducees. The Pharisees were teachers of the law. Their name likely comes from the Hebrew perushim, meaning the separated ones, those who sought to live in holiness, set apart for God. They were not priests. They did not run the temple or offer sacrifices. Instead, they lived among the people, in towns, in villages, in everyday life. Their goal was to make the holiness of the temple possible everywhere, by teaching that every home could be pure, every meal could be sacred. They believed that the law of Moses had two parts: the written law recorded in Scripture, and the oral law, the spoken traditions that explained how to live out that written law in daily life. They studied both. They debated endlessly. They wanted to know how to obey God perfectly, in every detail. How to wash one's hands before eating. How to keep the Sabbath. How to tithe even the smallest herbs from one's garden. To the Pharisees, obedience was worship. They believed that if all Israel obeyed God's commandments, even for one day, the Messiah would come and God's kingdom would begin. Many Pharisees were admired. They were lay scholars, rabbis, and moral leaders. They taught in synagogues, interpreted scripture, and guided the people in purity and ethics. They also believed in things that others denied, in angels and spirits, in life after death, and in resurrection, that the righteous would rise again in the world to come. These beliefs set them apart from their rivals, the Sadducees. The Sadducees were very different. They were the aristocrats, the priestly families who controlled the temple in Jerusalem. Their name may come from Zadok, the high priest of ancient Israel, suggesting that they saw themselves as his spiritual heirs. They were wealthy, powerful, and conservative in religion. They accepted only the written law, the first 5 books of Moses, the Torah. They rejected the oral law that the Pharisees valued so highly. For the Sadducees, holiness was found in ritual and order, not in endless interpretation. They focused on temple sacrifices, priestly duties, and maintaining the correct forms of worship. They also held different theological beliefs. They did not believe in resurrection, nor in angels or spirits. To them, reward and punishment came only in this life, not in a future world. Politically, they cooperated with Rome to preserve their power. They held many of the high priestly offices and were members of the Sanhedrin, the Jewish ruling council. While the Pharisees influenced the people, the Sadducees controlled the institutions. To the average Jew, the Sadducees seemed distant, even cold, guardians of a system more concerned with ritual than compassion.
The differences between Pharisees and Sadducees often led to fierce debate. They argued about purity, taxation, the Sabbath, and the afterlife. They disagreed on how to interpret Scripture, whether the law was flexible or fixed. In the temple courts and in the Sanhedrin meetings, their voices clashed. The Pharisees accused the Sadducees of neglecting the deeper meaning of the law. The Sadducees accused the Pharisees of adding human traditions to divine commands. And yet, both groups shared one goal: to preserve the faith of Israel under the heavy shadow of Roman rule. When Jesus appeared, teaching with authority, performing miracles, and drawing great crowds, both Pharisees and Sadducees took notice. But their reactions were different. The Pharisees were fascinated and alarmed. Some saw Jesus as a fellow teacher. Others feared he undermined their traditions. He healed on the Sabbath, ate with sinners, and claimed that mercy mattered more than ritual. To the Pharisees, who prized obedience above all, this was dangerous. The Sadducees, meanwhile, saw Jesus as a threat to their authority. His popularity stirred unrest. His words about destroying the temple and rebuilding it in 3 days struck them as blasphemy. For both groups, Jesus' growing influence was unsettling. At the top of Jewish society stood the Sanhedrin, the council of 71 elders that governed religious and some civil affairs. It included both Pharisees and Sadducees.
The high priest, often a Sadducee, presided. The Pharisees, though fewer in number, influenced the people through their teachings in synagogues. This created a fragile balance, one of law, power, and politics. When Jesus was arrested and brought before the council, the tension between these groups became clear. The Sadducees, seeking to protect the temple and avoid Roman punishment, demanded his death. The Pharisees, divided among themselves, hesitated, some silent, some questioning. According to the Gospels, it was this mixed council that condemned Jesus to die, handing him over to the Roman governor, Pontius Pilate. Afterward, the fragile unity of the Jewish world would never be the same. In the year 70 CE, when the Romans destroyed the temple, everything changed. The Sadducees, whose identity depended on the temple, disappeared from history. Their priestly line ended. Their rituals could no longer be performed. But the Pharisees survived. They had already built a faith rooted in study, prayer, and community, not in sacrifices alone. Under the leadership of Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, the Pharisaic tradition continued in the town of Yavna, and from it grew Rabbinic Judaism, the foundation of Jewish faith today. The oral traditions they preserved were later written down as the Mishnah and Talmud, texts that still shape Jewish life around the world. Thus, though they were once rivals, only one group's vision endured. The Pharisees' belief in study, prayer, and holiness in daily life became the heartbeat of post-temple Judaism. When we read of the Pharisees and Sadducees in the Gospels, it is easy to see them only as opponents of Jesus. But in truth, they were men of conviction, products of their time, striving to understand God amid oppression and uncertainty. The Pharisees sought holiness through discipline and law. The Sadducees sought order through ritual and authority. Both, in their own way, wanted to preserve the faith of their fathers. Jesus challenged them not because he despised them, but because he called them, and all people, to something greater, a religion of the heart. In their story, we see a reflection of our own human struggle between tradition and transformation, between power and faith, between the comfort of law and the call of grace. The streets of ancient Jerusalem have long fallen silent. The temple stones are cold ruins now. But the echoes of those debates between Pharisee and Sadducee, between ritual and mercy, still reach across the centuries. They remind us that faith is never static. It grows, it questions, it seeks. And perhaps, somewhere in those ancient arguments, we can still hear the whisper of truth, the same voice that called fishermen, scholars, and priests alike to follow the way of love.